President Volodymyr Zelensky made the promise during his election campaign that he will try to seek peace in Ukraine's war with Russia. And since then, he's put forward a number of different proposals. They are quite confusing because they seem to change very often. But basically, what he's been talking about, which I can kind of gist into three plans. Now, at the moment, there's Plan A and Plan B. I would add Plan C, and probably by next week there'll be Plan D and Plan E, because this seems to be very much a moving target. Plan A is Zelenskys' baby, and this is what led to the various protests around Ukraine. Let's remember these are not just Western Ukrainian or Poroshenko-paid protests. I was in Dnipro just a few days ago over the weekend, and they have a center against capitulation in Dnipro, which is eastern Ukraine. So this is something all over the country. It's not just West Ukraine. And I think because of these protests, Zelensky backtracked on his original Plan A, which seemed to be too much in favor of what Russia was seeking. And then this is why Russia, in turn, is dragging its feet about coming to the Normandy summit meeting, and it doesn't look like it's going to happen this year. It was supposed to happen in October, November, and now it doesn't look like it's going to happen again. Why? Because there's simply no consensus between both parties on what should be the steps. Ukraine has made some controversial steps of pulling back its troops in some areas on the conflict line. There doesn't seem to be any reciprocation on the Russian side. So we'll see what happens with Plan A. But the very fact that Zelensky's team and the foreign minister are talking already about Plan B, to me indicates they're not very optimistic that Plan A will succeed. The irony about Plan B is that basically it's just Poroshenko's. We're going back to Poroshenko line. Of course, Zelensky would never admit that because he doesn't like Poroshenko. You could even say he hates him. But what was the Poroshenko line? Well, it was twofold. Ukraine and Western governments said that there should be firstly steps to deal with security issues in the Donbass, such as returning the border to Ukrainian control, demilitarization, and then you take political steps, such as maybe some kind of special status for those areas controlled by Russia, and elections. Russia said the opposite. No, we have political steps first, then security steps. Now, the other part of the Poroshenko's proposals was to bring in UN peacekeepers. There, Ukraine and Russia also had a different viewpoint. Ukraine's viewpoint, as the same way as the Western viewpoint, was to have the peacekeepers on the Ukrainian-Russian border. Russia said, no, we're going to have the peacekeepers on the conflict line, which would be the same as in Transnistria in Moldova, or say South Ossetia and Abkhazia, which would just freeze the conflict. The issues here are that, again, there's a difference of opinion of how to approach these questions. Plan C, which hasn't been called Plan C, but basically is Plan C on the part of the Ukrainian authorities, is something that Alexander Motyl raised already a couple of years ago. And it probably has some support, particularly in Western Ukraine. And that is to kind of, not maybe completely, but to say, well, we've tried our best, we can't bring peace to the Donbass, and therefore to hell with it in many ways, and to kind of go down the route of, shall we say, Greek Cyprus, saying we've temporarily lost northern Cyprus under Turkish control, so Cyprus has been used as the comparison here, and that you have basically a freezing of that conflict in Cyprus, and you have a freezing of the conflict in the Donbass, where Ukraine basically turns its back on that region. I don't think that would be the worst option, but of course, it's not going to be a very popular option, especially amongst Ukrainian nationalist groups who would say we're turning our backs on Ukrainians and on Ukrainian territory. But the reasons that there are difficulties, continuing difficulties, despite Zelensky's arrogance and naivety, are numerous, and therefore I'm not very optimistic that there will be any breakthrough. And we can synthesize these in the following ways. Firstly, Russia and Russian leaders like Putin believe Ukrainians are fake news. That makes it, they don't treat Ukraine with the respect. There's no respect for Ukrainian sovereignty or Ukraine's territorial integrity. And when you have a partner like that, how can you go negotiate with them? Secondly, Putin is not Boris Yeltsin, of course. And that's not only because he always takes his shirt off and he's more sober than Yeltsin, but also because I just can't imagine trying to negotiate a compromise with Putin. He's a pathological liar. I just watched the new Ukrainian movie called Ilovaisk about the tragedy of the war in late August of 2014. At that stage, Putin said, we'll create a corridor for Ukrainian troops to withdraw peacefully. What they did is created a corridor and massacred Ukrainian troops. You can't believe a word that this guy says. This is a product, of course, also of his KGB mentality, and coupled with that is his Russian chauvinism towards Ukraine. Compromise for Putin, which he could probably achieve with somebody like Zelensky, not with Poroshenko, but with Zelensky. Compromise for Putin is defeat. It's not a sign of strength. And therefore, for Putin, there are demands, Ukraine has to fulfill them, and that's it. There's no attempt to kind of negotiate a middle ground. Thirdly, Zelensky keeps talking about the Crimea and Donbass as one problem, which he's right to do so. For Ukrainians and Ukrainian opinion polls, that's the case. But in Russian eyes, it's a bit more different. If in Russian eyes, the Crimea is a closed subject. It's not open for negotiations. And as for the Donbass, Russians claim they're not there. We are not involved in the Donbass. This is a civil war. How can you negotiate with somebody who's lying so blatantly that they're not involved in the Donbass? And as a consequence of this, the Russian position is Ukraine should negotiate directly with the separatist leaders, which again would be not a very popular step for Zelensky to take. Coupled with that would be a demand on the part of Russia for an amnesty for these separatist leaders and soldiers, again, which would not be very popular in Ukraine. When Zelensky talks about demilitarization, he never defines what it means, and I don't think he has a clue what it means. Let's make a comparison. I grew up with a terrorist problem in Northern Ireland called the Troubles over 30 years. When there was the Good Friday Agreement in 1997, there was the question there also of demilitarization, de-weaponization. There you had about 2,500, call it even 3,000 terrorists. They were lightly armed, relatively speaking. They had machine guns, grenades, handguns, but nothing really much more, maybe a few surface-to-air missiles. But this is very different to the 1st and 2nd Corps of the DNR and LNR, which have 35,000 troops and have every manner of military technology, from tanks, armored personnel carriers, missiles, modern technology, just miraculously that they received from I don't know, from a wholesaler somewhere in Ukraine and not from Russia. Coupled with the 35,000, you have about 5,000+ Russian intelligence and military officers who are running these 35,000. So a total of 40,000. How do you demilitarize 40,000 when we know demilitarizing 2,500 to 3,000 in Northern Ireland was a difficult question? In the Minsk Accords and for Ukraine, the question would be to send them these 35, 40,000 to Russia. But is that really going to happen? The Russian approach is to say, no, these 35,000 or so have to be reconfigured as some kind of local national militia, kind of border guards and such like security forces who would run these enclaves which have special status. I just cannot accept that any Ukrainian politician in Kiev, except the opposition, pro-Russian opposition platform, would agree to the legalization of the separatist forces as a kind of a new unit. It's basically an army inside a Russian army legalized inside Ukraine. That's simply not going to happen. But then you have to deal with the question: what do you do with these? And the 5,000+ Russians who are running these first and second corps would inevitably change their uniforms to local uniforms and begin to pretend that they are from the Donbass. So they would continue to run them even after they were legalized in Ukraine. Zelensky, if he tried to do that, he would be probably impeached, or he would be there would be mass protests. Linked to this is the question of border control. If Russia did agree to return the border to Ukraine, the DNR and LNR would collapse. There's simply no question about it. This is not an ethnic conflict where you have deep-seated ethnic grievances, as in, say, South Ossetia or especially Nagorno-Karabakh. There is no ethnic side to this conflict. It's a purely artificial conflict created by Russia. And therefore, Russia has no intention of returning the border to Ukrainian control, which Ukraine would demand, what Zelensky's already demanded, what's in the Minsk agreement. And what Russia proposes is that the new legalized DNR, LNR security force would patrol the border together with Russia. So basically the same as now. Not Ukrainian border guards and Russian border guards. With Russia, we know that it's never enough. No matter how many steps you take towards a compromise, it's never enough. We even saw that with Yanukovych. He did everything that Russia demanded in 2010, and Russia continued to throw demands on Yanukovych, and this would be the same. This is the same with Zelensky. Zelensky's made a few steps forward, not popular, and Russia keeps making more and more demands, for example, linking the peace process and agreeing to go to a Normandy summit with Ukraine and Russia signing a new gas agreement. What Russia wants isn't the Donbass. The Donbass has simply no psychological importance in Russian national identity. What Russia wanted in 2014 were the crown jewels of so-called New Russia, Kharkiv and Odessa. So the Donetsk doesn't have that kind of symbolism in Russian identity. What Russia wants is Ukraine. It's not interested in Donbass. It wants Ukraine back. It wants to stop Ukraine moving westwards. It wants Ukraine to be set inside the Russian world, the Ruski Mir. And therefore the LNR and DNR are simply Trojan horses to try to create that return of Ukraine back. And the additional demands of Russia for that are for Ukraine to be transformed into a federalized state, something that's always been highly unpopular, even in eastern Ukraine, and for Ukraine to adopt a policy of a kind of Finlandization of neutrality, and therefore stopping its, ending its support for the goals which are in the Ukrainian constitution of moving or striving to join NATO and the European Union. So the odds of Zelensky having a breakthrough with Plan A are probably something like a 10-to-1 against. Plan B, well, we're just back to the Poroshenko kind of approach to the problem. Maybe he will not like to do that, and therefore will go to Plan C. Certainly, Zelensky comes across as somebody in a rush, somebody not really understanding all the nuances of the war, and why there's a war. And the reason why there's a war is a national identity question. Russia does not see Ukraine as anything but fake news. That is the crux of why there is a war. And I don't think Zelensky understands that, and I don't think Zelensky actually understands Ukraine. And that's why he was so shocked and surprised by the protests and claimed in this very Soviet way that these were all paid for by Poroshenko. So I'm hoping, and some Ukrainians hope, that Zelensky will go the way of Leonid Kuchma in 1994-95, when he also was elected and quite naive about Russia, but quickly learnt, as it were, that Russia is a very difficult creature to deal with, especially a Russia led by Vladimir Putin. So maybe Zelensky will learn very quickly and will follow in that sense Kuchma's steps. If he doesn't, he's going to create and provoke more and more protests against what he's doing, because Russia is not likely to reciprocate with any kind of compromise position. Russia has its very tough demands. It demands Ukraine accept those steps, and it doesn't really see anything else except that, and because Russia's goal is to get back Ukraine, a territory they believe belongs to them, and is Russian in inverted commas. Thank you.